Greetings, dear listeners. Last week, we recorded a live show at Bistro Cacao here in D.C. in cooperation with our friends at the Aspen Institute, the Gambrill Foundation, and the John Templeton Foundation. Sam Kimbriel sat down with political theorist Hélène Landemore and our friend Osita Nwanevu to talk democracy. To oversimplify a bit, Hélène wants to replace elections with civic lotteries. Osita thinks you'd lose something essential in the trade. They try to hash it out. As always, an engaging conversation. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
I want to say this is a series that we've done now for I think 3 years. Demir, I don't know where. Something like 3 years. These live tapings with Aspen Philosophy and Society, which I direct, and then with Wisdom of Crowds. This is the first one that we're doing in partnership with Yale. There's a new Center for Civic Thought at Yale, and we're just genuinely delighted to be partnering with Stephanie and Brian on this event, and then having Hélène, who is I'm on the external advisor board. You're on the internal. I don't know. There's some confusing.
I think I'm on the external advisor board too. I don't know.
There's a structure, and we're both involved with it somehow. And then I'm also delighted to have my friend Osita, who has been a delightful collaborator for a number of years, involved in this conversation. So I think that's all of the logistics. So I will now do a quick intro, and then we're just going to jump straight into the conversation. First of all, Hélène is professor of political theory, has been, I think, just a genuinely lively and delightful contributor to these debates for a good amount of time now, and has a beautiful book that has just come out called Politics Without Politicians, which is here, and also many copies over there that you should go and purchase afterward that'll be signed and everything. So that's the, I think, the basic prompt for this conversation, which is that I'm very interested in pulling out Hélène's conception of democracy, overall, the structural proposals she's making, but especially getting down to these primary first principles about what it is about democracy that we even value at all. What are the ways that you can think about the primary goods, and then what does that mean for how we actually conduct it in some kind of way? And then Osita has a book about democracy from last year called The Right of the People, which is, I think, one of the most sophisticated and interesting defenses and treatments of that, and I think agrees with a lot of the diagnosis about whether we do or don't have a democracy, and some of the proposals about how we might have a democracy that is working very well in a lively fashion, but also, importantly, disagrees with some of the key premises of Hélène's book. So it's going to be some lively conversation in that regard. So let's just start, Hélène, maybe just set out, first of all, what is it that you care about with democracy? Why even write about this topic at all? And then we can get into some of the specific themes.
So I guess I've been writing about democracy for some time now. I care about it for a number of reasons, and centrally the idea that it taps the wisdom of crowds, as per the title of your podcast.
Take a completely hypothetical phrase.
But then I also got to, observe and research actual democratic experiments like citizens' assemblies, and it uncovered, a number of dimensions that make democracy very desirable as well, including the more community-building dimension. And then what happened is that I read a book called The Keys to Democracy by the late Maurice Pope, which is a book I helped publish. It was kind of a lost manuscript that reemerged. Very visionary book, and it had making a case for lot-based democracy, and it had a quote in there, maybe at the beginning even, that just struck me and immediately gave me a sort of unifying metaphor for the kind of democracy I saw and I think is inspiring. And I wanted to write a book to sort of bring together all those trends and organize it around that metaphor. And the metaphor is a vision of democracy as a jolly hostess who tries to bring the shy people out, which is the quote by G.K. Chesterton initially that inspired me.
Say something about the shy people.
The shy people, so you would think, oh, it's the natural introverts, and there are quite a few out there, but maybe they're not the majority. But by it, I mean something broader, more inclusive in a way, which is, all the people who don't feel like they could run for elections and win, who just don't have the kind of power hungriness, ambition, boldness, charisma, attraction for the limelight that politicians seem to have as a common point. And that means that democracy seems custom-made for basically a tiny fraction of the population. And if you take the G.K. Chesterton metaphor seriously, it should be the other way around. It should be about bringing the shy people out, or at least trying to, an attempt like that of a real hostess to bring the shy people out. So if you flip that vision and that ambition, I think then we need to start thinking about politics without politicians, without the bold, without the loud, without the ambitious. What would it look like? What does it mean in terms of restructuring the center of power, the place we call the people's house, for example? Why do we keep staffing it with people that are not the majority of people, that have ambitions and desires and preferences that are so unrepresentative of the rest of us?
Yeah, so I think before we go on to some specifics, it feels like that is, it feels worth underscoring how much that's a very controversial view of politics, that in many respects, I think historically, but also recently, we have this kind of view that politics just is about the triumph of strength, that you always are going to have a contestation for resources or for attention or for control in some way, and that it is going to be the people who have the most capacity and muscle or charisma that are going to be victorious. So, roughly like your case is that the goal of democracy is specifically to be contrary to that trend, and you also do think we can pull it off. Like, in that sense, that's a very hopeful...
Well, so I would say if you zoom out of the last 250 years, I'm not sure it's contrary to the deeper trend, of democracy as people's power, democracy as like a space where everyone is invited to talk about the problem in the local village and solve it together. Like the vision you're describing is very specific to, Western Europe circa, 18th, 19th century, where a group of elites and very smart people thought that, we just need to create a republic, not a democracy, empower the smartest and most educated and wealthiest amongst ourselves. But, we are going to try to make sure that their ambitions check each other, right? So we need to... So they redefine politics as this arena for the loud and ambitious, for the benefit of the rest of us, including the shy, but somehow I'm not sure that bet paid off, if you want. Like it became by the bold, but also for the ambitious and the wealthy and the connected. And the shy are kind of left out of the equation at the end of the day.
Okay, so that's a really useful way to set the analysis. Now, talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that you think about relating to or remedying this background circumstance?
Well, there are two ways. One is utopian, radical. It's pure political theory. It's like starting from scratch, re-envisioning the institutional translation of people's power in the 21st century, if we could really start from scratch, right? And I propose something that I also defended in a prior book called Open Democracy, which is, centered around a large assembly of randomly selected people, perhaps with executive power that is subordinated to that chamber and not elected through direct elections, but maybe appointed by that lot-based chamber. The other way is much more...
So this is kind of in the legislative primacy tradition?
Yeah, legislative primacy, exactly.
Yeah, over the executive.
Yeah. So the other way is much more reformist and realistic. It is, okay, we're starting from where we are now, not from scratch. There are some real merits to the system we're in still. It's still much better than the alternatives, for sure. So how do we create spaces for politics without politicians within that system where politicians still have the final say? So there, the natural route is more the route pursued by activists currently, a lot of them in Europe, organizing non-binding citizens' assemblies that convene for a few weekends, deliberate on the basis of expert recommendation, and come up with policy recommendations that then you take to the politicians, who hopefully have committed to implementing some of these recommendations, or at least justifying why they're not doing it. Or you take that to a referendum, which is the other way to get things done, and which has been done in Ireland on marriage equality and abortion, for example.
Okay, good. I think we'll come back to these. Like, there were some words there that seem important to me, like non-binding, and they offer recommendations. So it'll be good to come back to those in a moment. But before that, Osita, why don't you jump in? Give us like a sense about your conception of democracy, and then an initial kind of way that you'd want to start interacting with these ideas.
First of all, and thank you for being here. I don't know that I want to repeat myself to people who I think many of you came to the book talk I did a few months ago. But I think I've gotten pretty good at defining democracy in a nutshell as a system in which the governed govern. Governance is not given over to some king, some class of elites. The people who are themselves subject to governance are the ones doing the governing. And so in my book, I work through in the first parts ways in which you can tell this is true, and ways in which you can instantiate this. But there are obviously many different kinds of democratic design, and there are many different traditions of thinking about how you instantiate that as a value. And so, Helene's work, I think it's fair to say, comes out of the deliberative tradition to a large extent. So the idea that one of the things that we should take seriously when it comes to designing political systems is not just how we count the votes and who's represented and so on, but how do we actually communicate our political ideas to each other? What are the ways in which we make political decisions and form our political ideas? And this is a very important, I think, realm of thought. And frankly, I think Hélène has done more than anybody I've seen in the democratic theory community in the last 10 years or so to really propose and defend the idea that people are actually capable of participating in governance in a very, very deep way. People can participate in meaningful policy conversations and deliberate about them. And to say this, in the midst of a lot of skepticism, even within the academic community, about whether people are dumb, whether people are too tribal, and so on, I think is very, very important. So I think there's a critique of sortition that moves along those lines, right? Actually, we can't do this because people are too stupid in some way, or the people are not reading the right things. And that's not my critique at all. If you have that critique, you can try it in the Q&A. And I don't know, it's just not true or interesting to me. Our disagreements stem, I think, more from, as Sam was kind of saying, like these background questions about what democracy is, what representation is, the role, nature of political legitimacy, and so on. And I think maybe the way to frame the discussion for the purposes of sort of moving through all of these issues is to sort of think about the two different systems being proposed here and think about their ideal forms. So politicians in Washington are terrible. I'm not here to defend them or anybody in the city. I think Hélène is right about inequality and a lot of things that have gone wrong in DC and American politics. But I think the argument is actually that, yeah, if we did campaign finance reform and we addressed economic inequality and we addressed all of these kinds of issues, you'd still be left with, in electoral representation, a system that was inferior in meaningful ways to a kind of sortition where people are selected randomly. And so I think that's kind of the best way to frame things. So for me, when I think about electoral representation, it's a system where I or somebody, anybody in a given society, has the ability to choose somebody who is not me to go out and make policy, but hopefully they're doing so in my interests. Ideally, everybody in a given polity has the free and equal ability to do this, to organize also to do this, to organize to put certain things on the table and whatever. You have this kind of free agency to decide who is actually representing you when it comes to making policy in some body or not. Helene's view, as I understand it, is that we could replace much or all of that with a system where instead you would have people select random portions of the public, demographically weighted to match the public demographic makeup. And those people would be able to act instead of elected representatives. They'd be put in these ideal deliberative environments where people would be exposed to expert information. Have people come and talk to them about housing or climate or whatever it happens to be. People would talk amongst themselves. And then they come to a decision that ought to be understood as the representative decision of the public that they are coming from. And, there's been citizens' assemblies and other kinds of bodies she talks about a lot in this book that have shown, again, that people are capable of making good decisions, interesting decisions, or meaningful decisions in those kinds of bodies. But for me, the question is whether that actually counts as a true and meaningful kind of representation. To say to somebody, well, you were not going to select your representative. You're not going to choose somebody who's going to be there acting in your stead. We have assembled a picture or image of the public where somebody who resembles you in meaningful ways is probably going to be, and they're going to be put in a situation where they're going to act or make a decision roughly akin to what you would have done if you were in that room. That is a very, I think, different understanding of how democracy functions and what representation is and ought to be. And I think it raises a lot of questions about the internal construction of those spaces and how they are set up to be fair. But I think it's an important and interesting provocation because for me, I mean, it really tests and pushes our intuitions about how democracy could and should work.
So, I mean, jump in a little bit more directly. What are some of your misgivings about that? So it's, one thing I've heard you say is, okay, so this is a very different way of doing this that then shows how contingent some of the structures are that we've landed on. And we should be thoughtful about what we do as we do that. But I think your worry goes deeper than that, that actually if we start doing a kind of process by which you have not just, I think, some of the advisory views that you were describing, that you can convene people and that ends up giving like some broader sense of what a population might care about and that becomes a recommendation. But if a lot more politics becomes politics without politicians, that you do actually have some substantive worries there. Can you play out some of those?
Yeah, I mean, as we can think about this question of the shy. So, I mean, I think that one of the most important cases that's made for this system is that, as she was saying, like in electoral politics, the people who tend to end up on television or in Congress as our politicians are very charismatic people and so on. And that boxes out most of us. Most of us are not that way. And so it's like a weird angle. Thank you very much. So what we've seen actually in citizens' assemblies, though, is like, look, if you assemble a random selection from a given population, obviously the people who end up there are not just going to be charismatic people, not just going to be people who are good at speaking. You're going to get like a real cross-section of ordinary folks. And that will be an opportunity the shy have to actually express themselves that they wouldn't have because they're never going to be elected to Congress and so on. As a practical matter, in a country as large as the United States, with 300 and some million people, most of the shy are still not going to be in that room. You're going to get a subset of the shy population. As it stands now, if you are a shy person, which I think is the bulk of the electorate, you at least have the ability to say at the polls, here's somebody who represents my interests, here's somebody who thinks like I do. So it might be different than me, they might be more charismatic, more good-looking, whatever happens to be, but this is somebody I can trust and believe to do what I'd like to do. You don't have that, I think, in the kind of idealized sortition system that she's describing. Then there's also the question of how these spaces actually operate. If you're a shy person in electoral democracy, you have the privacy of the voting booth. You can go in without speaking to anybody, having to give an account of yourself, to do any kind of public speaking, to say what you think is right. If you happen to be one of the lucky shy who's selected for one of these bodies, you do have the responsibility, or at least the kind of expectation, that to represent your own interests, you have to stand up in front of people and explain yourself and make arguments, which I think is very daunting and another kind of inequality. And this is something that I think deliberative theorists have struggled with a lot. How do you create spaces that mitigate the natural differences you're going to have in any kind of randomly selected group of people that might impact the outcome? Yeah.
That's great. Let's pull in one question now, right there.
Actually,
and say your name.
Yeah, my name's Betty Ann Kane, and I'm a politician here in D.C. And I actually was talking with Professor Landemore earlier, and I'm a Yale alumni, also graduate school in English. But how do you have representative democracy without politicians? Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I was a shy person because I was a assistant professor of English at Catholic University, and I got invited to the school 3 blocks from here. And then I ran for school board. I'd never run for homeroom president, but it was, it's elected. Then I spent 12 years on the city council. And I don't understand, when did politician become a bad word? Because I think elected official, representative, I agree with you that democracy to me is representative government, the consent of the governed, and choosing people. And if you look at the local level, in any town, I spent half the summer in Maine, half the year in Maine, they have town meetings. But they have 3 selectmen, and they have to campaign, and they have to get elected, and they have to get reelected, and they have to listen to their constituents, and they have to be politicians. So, I guess, Professor, when did politician become a bad name, and how do we, recognize that it really starts, it should start, local government, you school board, then you're on the county council, then you're on the state legislature, then you might run for Senate or Congress or something.
That's
and
great.
Yeah, and you got to do those town meetings, but that's a different issue.
That's great. So, I do think that there's a force to that question, which is, I think that part of the drive for your book, which we can get into a little bit more, does have something to do with the broad sense that politics in general is dysfunctional, and particular in large national centers like Washington. I guess that the question...
But we don't have any representatives in Washington. So
part of what I think is valuable about the question is to say, actually, in many respects, democracies do elevate people who wouldn't actually normally have access into political office in some way, and that becomes a mode of empowerment. Does that resonate with you?
Sorry, are you describing my view or?
No, the questioner's view is sort of in that, she's defending politicians as a part of class of the shy.
Right. So let me go back to the question, when did politicians become a bad word? I just want to say that I didn't make it a bad word. The only reason why it resonates and why the title resonates is because somehow they made themselves unpopular and disliked and losing in legitimacy over the last few decades, I would say. So there's something about... and it's not just in the US, it's across the board, across Western democracies, emerging democracies. It is a general problem. So I'm just a diagnostic here, or I'm not blaming them for something, that I'm pointing out. It's there already. Now, I also want to answer the question of, okay, how can you have politics without politicians? There's this idea that politicians have to be elected, but let's go back to Federalist 10 and the definition of a republic versus a democracy. The republic was supposed to be a regime in which we delegate power to a small subset of the population that rules on behalf of others, which, by the way, goes against Osita's definition of democracy as government by the governed. It's government by a tiny number of people with the consent of the governed, what we have. It's not really a democracy in your sense. So then the democracy, by contrast, was supposed to be this direct form of decision-making in a small-scale community, right? All I'm saying is that this is a very simplistic way of looking at it. There's another way of looking at it, which is to say, okay, I grant that a democracy in the modern age needs to be representative in the sense of delegating the decision to a subset. The question is, how do we select the delegates? And we've constantly assumed since the 18th century that this has to be done through elections. But there's an ancient model that says, no, we can also do it another way, through sortition. And that, to me, is actually the only way to truly rotate the responsibility of governing throughout the entire political body. So instead of just the 10% of the population, those who go to law school, those who get degrees, those who speak well, having a shot at winning an election, you actually get rid of elections and distribute political office on the basis of one person, one lottery ticket.
Just define sortition quickly.
It's basically jury selection, like jury selection. It's a civic lottery. Again, one person, one lottery ticket.
And then when you think about that model, I'm going to ask Osita in a second to defend politicians. But when you yeah, please. Why don't hang on, just wait for the microphone.
Hi, just a clarification.
It's on.
Sorry. The lottery ticket you're talking about, does everybody get entered automatically, or do you have to consent, or can you opt out? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, okay, the question of consent, very good question. So in my ideal model, you are entered automatically. It's your right to be considered for these positions. And you, like for jury duty, you shouldn't be able to say no unless you have a very good excuse. That's a duty. So it's both a right and a duty. So it might seem too demanding to some, but I think in the best version, the most ideal version of that regime type, you'd have to demand mandatory participation to ensure that precisely it's not the usual suspects who just have to bow out or are not interested, and that you get a truly representative sample. There's a larger question of consent to the system, right? So one thing about elections is that you consent to the person being elected because you voted for them. Although the minority obviously did not consent to the person being because they're on the losing side. But so there's a second order consent, which is not to the particular person, but to the procedure, right? So we consent to leaving by the outcomes of elections.
Which is not too different from normal. I mean, this is a social contract.
Yeah, but what I could say, all I'm saying is that we could have it for the principle of sortition as well, right? We could have a referendum at some point to ask people, okay, are you willing to have a chamber that is based on random selection rather than selection? And if they say no, forget about it. Like, it doesn't matter, then we don't do it. But I suspect a lot of people are converging toward the idea that this is not so dumb after all. I mean, it depends. You have to define what would this assembly be for, what would exactly their power be. But if you look at France, we had our first really visible nationwide Citizens Assembly on climate in 2019-20, a year after, nobody knew what a Citizens Assembly was in 2019. A year later, I think it was something like 3 French people out of 5 knew what it was, and about that proportion among those who knew were considering that a Citizens Assembly was legitimate. So basically they would have consented to it if it was there to make proposals on behalf of the French people, meaning speaking for, meaning representing the French people, not in a way that not in a way that gave them the power to decide, but that gave them the power to decide the agenda.
Yeah, Osita, why don't you defend some politicians?
Sure. So,
or all of them.
I am defending the system. I mean, look. I mean, I think that the point that was raised over here is a good one. By one 2012 count, I believe there are some 500,000 elected offices in the United States. The people that we see on TV in D.C. or in our state legislatures are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of people who are elected as politicians in this country. The sheer number, I think, does raise its own democratic problems that we can talk about some other time. I think it's actually kind of crazy how many elected offices we have. But what this does mean, for the purpose of thinking through the political rights of the Shah, is that you can actually be elected to a sanitation board, school board, even your city council, without being a debate kid, without having a thirst for fame. So I think that's worth taking into consideration. But the other thing, too, is that even at that higher end, where we see charismatic people prevailing in elections, being selected, it is actually not obvious to me that this is more unjust than the fact that we tend to select brave people to be firefighters, or we tend to select kindly people to be preschool teachers, right? It may also be the case that the skills that we need to succeed in democratic politics, negotiation, communication, are just skills that certain people happen to have. And if you have the capacity and freedom to select them equally within a given population, it's not obvious to me that this is fundamentally unjust in a way that trouble us. But if it is, and we actually do think that we need to empower the Shah structurally in the system, again, I don't think it's trivial that as a practical matter, and as a country as large as this one, for sure, you are very, 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 very unlikely to find yourself selected as a Shah person to be part of this legislature. Now, in the book, as I've read it, you talk about this being mitigated on some level by the fact that there will be chambers of assemblies at different levels of government, right? So maybe you're not selected at the federal level, but you have a greater chance of being selected to a body, an assembly at the local level, at the state level, closer to you because that's a smaller population. And I think that's true. But I don't think that political representation is fungible in this kind of way.
Can I just push you on one part of this? So when you say that there's a question about how there are certain skill sets that could be useful here, you listed charisma, but then also negotiation, communication. We have a situation recently that doesn't seem like it's doing a lot of negotiating or communicating, but maybe charisma is a very strong power.
Which one?
I mean, I think in general within our politics over the past 30 years,
right,
you've seen a kind of power of charisma. Like when you think about the virtues needed for democracy specifically, is there a tension between those? Like when you're saying there are ways that the vocation of politics has particular requirements in a democracy, how much do you see that as a cohesive kind of personality type?
I mean, I think it takes different kinds. You have people who are best positioned to participate in politics at the level of elections. You're out there, you're on the campaign trail, whatever, in this kind of like high-level way, marshaling majorities, being part of the whatever it takes to sort of get legislation passed through Congress, that level of politics. And then there are wonks who work in the background and try to assemble the policies. There are people who try to work in their own communities, compassionately through different kind of there are different capacities, and the only people who matter in politics are not functionally politicians. I think the voters matter. I think the people in the background matter. I think that people who do policy work matter. All of these constitute, the realm of politics. And to say that the only people who have power or influence or say are the politicians because they're the most visible tip of the spear. Every politician in Washington, D.C. is like 50 staffers in a trench coat, right? Like that's functionally how it works. So I just think that there are a lot of different roles and capacities.
Many trench coats here.
Yeah, I don't have to tell people. Like it's there's so many different kinds of personalities and so many different kinds of roles somebody can play in politics at different kinds of dispositions.
So let's pull in this question here.
I was wondering if there's been any kind of study of kind of like a hybrid model, and I'm thinking of the Baha'i faith. I had a former boss who was Baha'i and on the National Baha'i Council, and they have a pretty sophisticated governing model for their faith community, where at the local level, people are chosen by being nominated amongst the community, and someone is then chosen by this kind of high form of consensus or kind of consultation model, and then those people from like a local community are then do the same thing for the national and then do for the international kind of Baha'i Council. And again, it's not a nation state, but it is like an international body of folks who are trying to organize themselves around certain values and ideals and et cetera. And I'm wondering if there's any, which isn't sortition and it isn't campaigning, you're explicitly not allowed to campaign, and it seems to work for them, but I'm wondering if there's kind of been studies on this hybrid model.
Hélène, what do you say?
Well, it sounds to me like what you're describing is a version of liquid democracy, I guess, meaning candidate-less elections, which I'm actually interested in. I think it's you remove one of the problems with elections as we practice them, which is a self-selection. People who declare themselves candidates, which again will attract the power hungry, the easily corruptible because they want power, the narcissistic types. Those are overrepresented once you have the self-selection. If you remove that and you let the community decide, hey, we love that person who does really great work but is actually very shy, you could elevate some shy that way, actually. I believe that. I've seen it in citizens' assemblies as well. So, but just to the point that Osita was making about what about, at least in elections, everyone gets a chance to participate. I just want to make clear that I'm not ruling out voting entirely. In fact, that's the second piece of the design, which I emphasize less, and I'm wrong to forget to do that. But I'm still in favor of frequent referenda. I like the Swiss model of 4 referenda a year, and I would like that paired with citizens' assemblies so that when they come up with a brand new agenda for the next 5 years on multiple dimensions, the key dimensions are put as a question to the larger people. So you would still get the campaigning around the referendum. You would still have political parties or the equivalent forming around these moments of mass decision and direct democracy. But the parties would no longer be vehicles for sending people to power. It would be quite a different model.
So because this is a question I had. So, are you saying that if at the point after the sortition assembly has made a decision and crafted a policy program, that whole program will be put to referendum and authorized, or like you will have to have passed a vote in the public to get what the sortition assembly has put together enacted?
I guess in the transition phase, you may want to have that safety valve of checking in with the public if they actually agree. And then as we become more familiar and more comfortable with, longer term delegations, maybe we check in with them less frequently. Or, I am not entirely sure. I think this was the Greek model, right? They had a council of 500 that set an agenda, and then they took that agenda to be deliberated on with the recommendations to the open assembly, which decided yes or no. That wasn't perfect because, the open assembly, the truly direct democracy moments was easily captured by powerful orators. So in the 4th century, they moved to a more mediated system with some of the legislation was then put in the hands of like these mini juries called nomothetai. So I think we'll have to do some exploration and some experimentation as well. I'm not saying I have the full blueprint, and I'm sure. The one thing I'd say, though, is that you said, just the same way we want kind teachers, we want ambitious politicians, because we know for sure that these are the qualities required to rule. I'm a lot more skeptical than you about this. I don't think we know what it takes to get a good leader necessarily. And I would also say that for me, the sort of key paradigm shift is to think of the quality of politicians as a group, if you want. Like if you move away from focusing on the properties of individuals to the property of the group, of the legislative assembly, you realize that if you continue single-handedly focusing on the properties of individuals, you're going to keep adding people to your group that might not as a whole make that much sense. So that's the move I made in my first book, Democratic Reason, where I say, look, collective intelligence is not just a function of the competence or the charisma or the spectacular skills of one individual multiplied by the number of individuals. It's a function of the average competence of these people and the diversity of the group. The way as a group they map out different ways of looking at the world, different solution spaces, etc. If you start thinking that way, you realize, wow, well, maybe we're not maximizing on the right thing by electing people.
So I'd like to make a couple of parts of this vision a little bit more concrete. So one is maybe just one very brief question, which is how long do you consider it's likely that the term would last once you get selected for one of these things?
I don't know. I think that we would start maybe with 1-2 years, something like that. And I would start at the local level, for sure. Like this is not something for the federal level anytime soon. I think we need to, because the other thing is that right now, the way these assemblies are run, they demand that people sacrifice their weekends. And it's not acceptable, I think. I think at some point we'll have to figure out a way to pay them for their time and take them away for their jobs, part-time, or some other way to do it.
I mean, so I think that the question that I'm interested in is how do you not just have this repeating the dynamics of politics, but sort of in a repetitive way that doesn't have some of the constraint structures? So if someone gets selected and then you get into, like, this is roughly what I think freshman year feels like, which is you get selected by someone, maybe your parents, thrown into a room with total crazy strangers, and then there's this astonishingly quick social dynamic of sorting that happens. And then as that sorting happens, it is just the case that, like, whatever, force of personality, charisma, athleticism, whatever it is, you end up getting a kind of internal hierarchy that's established very, very quickly. So I think that's one level that I'm interested in. Another is, it seems likely that one thing that would often happen is that you have a deficit of expertise. So especially if we're talking about this, like, growing to the point that it could actually be governing not just small municipalities or cities, but actually at a kind of like large continental sized democracy, the question is, like, how do you not get to the point where it's just like if you don't have people who have over 2 years, 5 years, a decade actually gained experience at thinking through things, deliberating, figuring out how to argue, figuring out how to negotiate, and then being able to make judgments, how do you not just have this like extremely turbulent kind of mob dynamic that's running through? And it seems like if you have the other model where people do start to gain capacity to deliberate and compromise and negotiate, then you just get politicians. I think. Do you see the sort of the two prongs of the dilemma?
So first, let's set the comparison point accurately. It's not as if the politicians we have are experts in everything, right? As you said, it's five people in a trench coat.
Might
so
protest.
the same way that politicians rely on an army of staffers and experts, we would give citizens access to an army of experts and staffers. So the playing field there would be, I think, leveled considerably. In fact, we've seen it happen over and over again. Like these citizens come in, and by the way, they're not morons. Like, you have engineers, roofers, teachers, former mayors. Like, the reality of our society is that people are actually quite educated, and they educate each other, and they bring in a wealth of knowledge and practical knowledge and lived experience, etc. That's actually sometimes a lot richer than what you get in a group of, again, people who've been to law school and then went into politics for 40 years and really learned nothing else. And they lived in these bubbles. And so, again, I question the question, the premise. Then the question of wouldn't they turn into politicians after a sufficient period of time? Well, I do think that the natural dynamics of sorting by affinities, etc., would replicate themselves eventually. You're right, but the fact is that these spaces are extremely curated and structured so that you constantly reshuffle. Like you try to prevent or only allow under certain conditions the formation of opinion groups, for example. So you make sure that you're constantly re-exposed to diversity, even within the assembly. It's a sort of, I think the heart of democracy really is a constant prevention from power concentration in some groups. And so you do it repeatedly. Finally, I think that, look, yes, they would stay in power for 1-2 years and you could turn into a politician in such a period of time. But still, it would be nothing compared to the 40 years that people stay in power currently. And they're still rooted in their own communities. They still have families and lives that they go back to that keep them quite grounded. And empirically, what I've observed, they were never long enough for me to see that transformation. But you do have some people who start acting like politicians. They love the journalists. They love to be invited on TV shows and answering questions. Well, there are always a handful of those. They're the ones who would be elected in the regular life. And actually, oftentimes they go and enter politics after this because they find their calling somehow. But then you have all the others that just don't change at all. They actually don't enjoy being interviewed by journalists. They just want to go home, but they still have discovered something about themselves. They are part of like the vast majority of people in these assemblies who say the experience has been transformative. It's reconciled them with their peers, with politics. So sure, some of them would turn into pricks, but not all of them,
It's a great question here.
I was going to ask about...
Say your name.
My name is Jacob. I'm at Johns Hopkins. So I was going to push you on to account more for the structural problems that you find with politicians and elections. But now I think you've already touched on a lot of that. So both of you, Osita and Hélène, have, in your respective books, talked about the need for democratizing the economy, right? And the capitalist economy is shot through with power. And when we theorize about democracy, we often leave out that aspect of our social system and don't think about it as something that needs to be theorized under aegis of democracy. So what do you two have to offer in terms of how we should think about the democratization of capitalism?
Yeah, so always the best question. Look, I mean, I think Hélène has been a real leader on this as well. I mean, there's this great project I think we were talking about before called the Democratized Work Project, where academics from around the world are really pressing the case that if you care about democracy, because you have this idea about human agency, that we're entitled to some measure of control over our lives, obviously, the places where we spend about a third of our lives, we derive our incomes, we have democratic entitlements there. We're just not used to thinking about them. And so, yeah, I think Hélène has done a lot of wonderful work on that question. I offer some thoughts on my end. And there, I think, the solutions I kind of pose in that respect are kind of like the solutions that I pose in the political sphere as well. I think there are different kinds of institutions that can be set up, experimented with. I should say here, I'm not fully and entirely against the idea of sortition. I think that in conjunction with other kinds of representation, other forms of agency, it makes a lot of sense. If you replace the United States Senate tomorrow with a randomly selected body that was next to the House and under the president, I think it would be an improvement. But the question, no, I'm sorry. The question is, this background idea of that final step, is this not just an augmentation of politics as we know it and a way to improve politics as we know it, or is this a way of replacing electoral representation entirely? And that's, I think, the kind of rub there. And I mean, I'll let you talk about the economic issues if you want to, but I do think that there's a looming kind of background difference here too about basically what the ends of democracy are. What do we think we're actually trying to accomplish? What is the nature of the political disagreements that we have when we do democratic politics? And presumably, if we entered into an economic democracy, what are the grounds we disagree about things there as well? And there is a tradition in the deliberative school that sees democracy in large part as having a kind of epistemic responsibility. Democracy is supposed to be the means by which we get to the right answers to certain political questions, perhaps through harnessing collective intelligence the way that you've described. For me, I think that is an important element of what democracy could do, potentially. I think that there's something to the idea of collective intelligence. But I also think that Hélène and I disagree about the extent to which our political disputes are actually questions of having the right information or getting the right access to information, as opposed to disagreeing on the basis of principles and values and things that are not reducible to something you can discover having talked to an expert.
It sounds, Osita, like you don't believe in the wisdom of crowds.
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think that a lot of our political there are different kinds of wisdom, right? There's the wisdom of, when I'm thinking about the death penalty, for instance, as an issue, I can read the papers and I can know how much it costs to put somebody to death and whether or not it's empirically effective in reducing this or that level of crime. That's a kind of wisdom. And then there's also the realm of, is this right or wrong? Even if it were effective in these 5 different ways of reducing crime and achieving these kinds of ends, is it correct to have a state that has the power to do this to a human being? That is a fundamentally different level of political consideration. And I think one of our differences is that I think that more of those kinds of disputes lie at the heart of our politics than Hélène does. And if you think that the questions that divide us in politics are more about the facts and more about whether we have access to the right kind of information, then it becomes very, very appealing to adopt a view of politics where you say, well, the ideal thing to do is get people in a room where they're listening to the right experts. And then they'll be driven to making the kinds of decisions that they, in their non-deliberative state outside of those rooms, would not be able to make on their own. And I think that raises, again, certain tensions that I think are interesting to think about. But
Hélène, yes. Why don't you respond to that?
So actually, I'm going to reject that description of my position because I agree with you that politics is also about fundamental moral disagreements. But unlike you, I guess I think wisdom is also about these moral questions, and that I believe in some sort of moral truth that we don't know how to access, but the fallible way to access them is in part through deliberation. So death penalty, abortion, we're still trying to figure it out, and probably we never will, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't assume there's some kind of moral truth we're trying to reach, and that we're also building the value background against which we can say whether this is right or wrong. So anyway, it's a very complicated dimension. But what I'll concede is one thing that I'm not sure about is that to the extent that we have to decide, and at some point you've run out of arguments, and you've really reached the point where this cannot, you cannot convince the other person, you cannot be convinced by the other person. Do we need a specific chamber that would be just about this kind of arbitrage, where then it becomes about just deciding and going with the larger number, pretty much like a form of pure majoritarian decision making? Can we not do that work within citizens' assemblies as well? And I don't know. All I know is that on the question of end of life, so whether or not to allow for assisted dying and forms of euthanasia in the French case in 2023, 24, we had this big disagreements, and they were not about the facts, or not only about the facts or about the science. They were about the meaning of life. Is it a gift? Is it something that I dispose of? The sacred and all of that. So we had religious people who testified. We had doctors who testified. At the end of the day, they converged. Even those who disagreed and who were opposed to liberalizing the law voted for the final report. So I think it was voted with like 87% approval, because they felt heard, because their agenda had been taken into account. It was about palliative care, making sure before we even give people a choice to take a pill or not, or an injection or not, you give them the best conditions to alleviate their pain, which currently in France we're not doing. So then they agreed, and they reconciled their differences through that report, right? So I just don't know. Do we really need an extra chamber for just conflicts, which seems to be what elected assemblies are about, and keep the deliberation, the constructive deliberation, for something like a lot-based assembly? I'm not sure. Then on the democracy stuff in the workplace, I'm totally aligned with you on this. I think that it seems so obvious to me that, the workplace is another place of political, exercise of power, injustice, domination, etc. People should have not just an exit, which is very limited under the condition of capitalism. They should have a voice, and not just about, when is my next break, but like literally about at the level of the board of administrators, which is not so far-fetched. Like the Germans have had that since 1948. It's in their constitution. Like beyond a certain size, you have to have representatives of employees on the board of administrators. Currently, my friend Isabel Ferreras, who actually founded this movement, Democratize Work, just proposed a report to the Spanish government about how to materialize an article in the Spanish constitution that says that the job of the government is, among other things, to democratize the workplace. And so they came up with all kinds of recommendations. So I don't know why this conversation is so difficult to have in the US, where I think it's because of the centrality of some thinkers like Milton Friedman since the 1980s, obviously economic interests that get in the way. I also think it's because we make the mistake of conflating capitalism with the markets. For me, that's not it. The markets are the markets. Capitalism refers to the primacy of shareholders. It's simply the fact that the only ones who get to decide in corporations are shareholders and their representatives. But you could have the markets and a different system, which I would call multi-stakeholderism. Well, those who get to decide in corporations are not just the shareholders, but also the employees. And if we could only separate those things, I think the conversation would be much more sane. Because as soon as you criticize capitalism, you're seen as anti-markets, then you've lost the crowd.
So I want to get two more questions in, please.
Just a quick
Say your
question.
name.
Elizabeth McWhorter. I'm with the Department of War. I'm just a question about if we're talking about eliminating specialty in the government, I'm from West Virginia. A representative was very, very covered in Robert's Rules of Order. How do you
I have no idea who you're talking about.
how do you keep us from eliminating that speciality in government?
That's great. So yeah, so this is
with going to an uneducated.
Yes, this is back to the role of expertise, and then we'll do one more question over on the. So yeah, just say something about the role of expertise, and then go
Quick,
go
hi,
yeah.
Nancy Sherman. I teach at Georgetown. So just a quick question regarding money and corruption. You can't, no matter what you do. First, the original question had to do with individuals are always part of groups, so they represent their group implicit ways. But also, simply to operate, to get to assemblies, back and forth to your homes, to get paid, to run, no matter what, costs money. So money leads to corruption, etc. Can you speak a little bit about money?
I mean, in some ways, these are kind of parallel questions, right? So it's like you get thrown into this thing, and on the one hand, one thing that having a kind of well-developed political culture of politicians does is it tries to say, okay, like here are types of expertise that we know are running through these systems. And then I think the other one is there are sort of familiar channels that, at least in ideal cases, you use to try to cut off corruption. And I think that question of, you know, if this stays at the level of being an advisory enterprise where it's proposing some recommendations, then there's some other moments of political process. That seems like one thing. If it ends up actually, I think the real question is if this ends up taking on the actual deliberative and decision-making power of the society, suddenly the incentive to distort the process just becomes extremely high. So how do you think about both of those?
No, these are excellent questions that deliberative Democrats ask themselves a lot. I'm not sure we have all the answers, but we are working on them. I would say, look, first of all, there are already cases of citizens' assemblies or equivalent or similar processes that have decision power right now. So in Oost Belgium, you have a council of 24 randomly selected citizens. It's a small area of Belgium, 70,000 people, that have the power to put items, questions on the agenda of the local parliament and the power to convene citizens' assemblies on specific issues. And it's kind of like supposed to be binding, right? You also have the case of the Michigan Redistricting Commission in the U.S., which solved corruption in a way by taking the gerrymandering out of the hands of politicians and giving the power to draw the maps to a random group of 15 citizens. I think it's 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 5 Independents. So it's a solution to corruption, if anything. So I would also mention the Climate Convention of 2019 in France, which was kind of like given the legislative initiative that normally belongs to the Prime Minister's office. So it's already there anyway. What do we see? Yes, of course, if you have power, you're going to attract capture attempts, corruption attempts. Well, it's not like the current Congress is immune to this, right? I mean, so we are going to have to find solutions for that too. All I'd say is that it's much harder to capture people who are going to rotate quite frequently instead of building long-term relationships over 20 years. It's also much harder to promise to a farmer that you're going to hire him for, I don't know, one of those cushy jobs of lobbyists, right? Whereas you can do it all the time with politicians, no problem, because it looks legit. This would be obvious corruption, much more. So I don't know. I don't have all the answers. You can create firewalls. You can count on the gyroscopic sort of ethos of citizens who frown upon those attempts and fight them. I've seen it. I document it in my articles and books. So I'm just saying there's no bulletproof system. But I see the advantages of that system over the current one.
So just to conclude, I want to ask you both. I mean, I think, Hélène, your proposal is very clear. Just give a couple of comments, each of you, on, and I think the contrast is also very, very clear between you. Give a couple of comments on what you think about the possibilities of rejuvenating an actual democratic tradition in a very robust way. Like, what are a couple of the steps that you think, wait, actually, if this turns out well, that you do have more space for the shy? What does that look like in various respects? Maybe, Osita, let's start with you.
I mean, there was this question earlier about why Americans have not been as into the concept of economic democracy. Like, what are the barriers? And I think that there are barriers when it comes to money and politics, the kind of conversations that we do and don't have. That's part of it. But I think people, too, have this conception of democracy here where it's not actually about their own agency. It's about institutions. It's about norms that safeguard the way things have been. And we don't really have a culture of asking ourselves what we're entitled to as human beings. and a culture of saying that on the basis of those ideals, we are then obligated or have at least the right to interrogate our institutions and to change them transformatively, if we find that that's, in the words of the Declaration, most likely to secure our happiness. I think that kind of culture is, for me, an even more daunting challenge. You can imagine campaign finance reform, you can imagine lobbying reform, all of these different kinds of laws. But the way the public itself is acculturated to think about politics and the expectations it has for itself, there aren't things you can fix by policy. And so again, this is one of the reasons why I think I really appreciate Helene's book and Helene's work, as many disagreements as we might have, because it is a book about people believing that they can do more, and a book about encouraging us to think more radically about the way things have been and tell ourselves we have the right to change things. And I think that we're in a moment now where things are so obviously failing on so many different fronts that people, I hope, are newly receptive to those kinds of ideas. So it's a very loose and woolly answer, but that's kind of how I think.
So I'll answer with a very concrete example of what you can do. Because I'm doing it this summer, we're organizing a citizens' assembly in Connecticut on property taxes. We sent out 240,000 invitation letters at random. We only need a pool of 700 people answering to volunteer to create our sample of 100. We already are over 1,900 positive answers. I mean, people are hungry, are desperate for an opportunity to do something more meaningful than, honestly vote in a way that doesn't seem to change anything. Or give money, because you don't even know where that money is going, and all it seems to be going to are spin doctors who send you terrible ads on TV. So I feel like what we're trying to create are like spaces for people to reconnect with each other across partisan divides, across age groups, across races, across all the things that are pulling us apart and making us hate each other. And another message from the book that we didn't get to talk about, but it's really about love and about precisely learning to, appreciate others as civic, brothers and sisters, really. In a sense, it's finding those bonds again and recreating them. And so, again, it's only 100 people. You're right, Osita, to point that out. But we're also hoping to create, outside that assembly, local meetings for people who just want to get together and deliberate about the recommendation that will come out of this assembly, fueled by ice cream. One of our partner, Ben & Jerry, might actually donate ice cream, which is great.
That's a solution.
You left that at the
end.
Yeah, wait a second.
The solution is love and ice cream. That could be a vision of democracy that people are drawn to.
No, we agree now. Yeah. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks especially to Hélène and Osita.